Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Mindful Hunter podcast. I'm your host, as always, Jay Nichol. And our guest today is Mr. Bryan Broderick, the founder of Day 6 Gear, which for those of you who don't know, is basically a comprehensive archery system that consists of arrows, components, broadheads, vanes, custom arrow, building options, the whole 9 yards. And I would say it is a unique design philosophy. Like, they adhere to very firm design principles in what Bryan believes, makes for good arrows, good broadheads, and proper flight and penetration of said arrows and broadheads. This was one of those conversations that you have, and it's like, why didn't I ask this guy a couple of years ago to be on this podcast? I really like the way Bryan thinks about design. I also really like the way Bryan thinks about business. So we spent the first third of this kind of talking about his background. Bryan is a very successful man, so that always intrigues me because I'm always looking to learn from people like that. And I think that when you're successful at one thing, it translates over to other, pursuits that you have in your life as well. So instead of just digging into hunting tactics all the time, sometimes it makes more sense to get into the deeper principles of a way someone lives their lives, and you can learn more about that and then apply it to your own situation. So this was a great conversation. I hope you guys enjoy it. Little bit of housekeeping. So forgedinthebackcountry.com, the lifestyle apparel brand I've created for backcountry hunters, doing very well. If you would like to purchase some clothing, please head on over there. I was just texting with Cody, the bear hunt winner, yesterday. We've got our bear hunt coming up at Landers here in just under 5 weeks. That's super exciting. Mindful reviews. If you enjoy unbiased, non-sponsored gear reviews and you want to join a community of like-minded individuals who are all just trying to become better hunters and make better gear decisions, mindful-reviews.com. And then finally, I think there might be 1 or 2 last-minute black bear dates available at Landers. If you're looking for an affordable black bear hunt in British Columbia, get a hold of me and I will put you in touch. Also, this October, the 2nd and 3rd week of October, I will be guiding archery mule deer in Alberta. This is an extremely challenging hunt, so don't take it lightly. This is definitely not a gimme hunt in any way, shape, or form, but there's some big-ass deer as well. So, where there's risk, there's reward. There are 2 openings left this season. If you think you'd like to come to Canada, specifically Alberta, and chase big old mule deer bucks in the prairies and the coulees, super cool hunt. I've done this hunt myself. Get a hold of me and we will work something out. So as always, I thank you for tuning in. I thank you for your engagement. If you could take a brief moment and, just share something if this podcast was beneficial to you. Hit the like button on whatever platform you're on. Maybe go leave a review on whatever podcast platform you like. Post a story, send it to a friend. I would greatly appreciate it. If you find value in this and you shared it with others, that'd make my day. So I greatly appreciate it. Without further ado, Mr. Bryan Broderick of Day 6 Gear. Welcome back to the Mindful Hunter podcast. I'm your host, as always, Jay Nichol, and today we have Bryan Broderick, who is the founder of Day 6, who makes very high-quality arrows, components, broadheads, etc., with what I would call very firm design principles. And we're gonna get into that, but I would actually like to kind of step back a bit further before we start talking arrow technology. But first of all, Bryan, I know you're a busy guy. I appreciate you taking the time to come on the podcast.
Oh man, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
We have a dear mutual friend in Jeff Lander who was just at your little place a while ago, and I've always had it on the back of my mind to have you on, but he was at your place, and I'm getting these texts, and he's like, "You got to have Bryan on, man." Like, he is like gear nerd to the nth level, like you are. Like, you guys are gonna really line up on some stuff. So I was like, as soon as I was getting those texts, I'm like, okay, well, that's normally all the nudge that I need. It also, a warm intro
Yeah.
also helps when you're sending out podcast invites. I've been aware of you. I've run the Day 6 system for quite a long time. I would love to hear a little bit of your story, because you're one of these guys that kind of fascinates me in the industry. You know, launching an arrow in a broadhead company is not something you do off the back of a credit card. Like, you have had some successes in your life. And I think, you know, on these hunting podcasts, we focus a lot on how to be a successful hunter. I think there's a lot more to be gained when we can back up a little bit and say, how did you become a successful man? Because those same principles that you've applied in business, in your relationships, in your faith, are those same principles that, if we apply them in our hunting, will lead to, sure, that the techniques and the technical details are different, but I firmly believe the underlying principles are the same. I'd love a brief kind of 10,000 foot view of your story. How did you get exposed to hunting? What's your education like? What were your first businesses? How did you first get exposed to entrepreneurship? I'd just love to hear a little bit of your story to kind of kick things off.
Well, so honestly, my dad was not a hunter at all.
Okay.
He was more into racing, motocross, water sports. He was a wrestler, so he had me in boxing at an early age, but he wasn't a hunter. My grandfather on my mother's side was like my second father, and he was a hunter. And I'm 51 years old now, and I can look back and honestly say, out of all the hunters that I've known, met, been associated with, you know, thousands and thousands, you know, of hunters over the last 50 something years, my grandfather is probably top 5 worst hunters ever.
That was not where I thought that was going, man.
I mean,
oh Lord,
he has to be top 5 worst I've ever been around. And so that was kind of my genesis in my exposure to hunting, is how to do it the wrong way.
Right.
And, but I was really blessed. I had a gentleman at the church that worked with our youth group. My parents ran the youth group there. And, he was a bow hunter, and he was a hunter, and he hunted with us at my grandfather's place. We had 380 acres that everybody at the church hunted. So it was
probably did not contribute to your grandfather's success very well.
No, because he was so nice and generous, and everybody hunted. And so, like, it was, you know, it looked like a trailhead in Colorado,
right
at the gate, you know, opening day on 380 acres.
So funny.
Yeah, it was hard. But this gentleman at the church, I owe everything to. He not only was a bow hunter, he was a trapper. And he wasn't just a bow hunter and a trapper. He was top 5 that I've known in my life as the best. He was a badass at it. And man, he taught me to bow hunt. He taught me to trap. He helped me get my first bow. And he took me elk hunting the first time when I was 19 years old in 1991, public land, New Mexico. No internet, no GPS, no rangefinders. So what I'm saying is that's how I learned to do a lot of this stuff, was the hard way.
Yeah.
And when you ask about entrepreneurship and business and success and all of my progressions, it's all been hardship. It's all been the hard way. So I was going to school for building science. That's where I was going, so I could go into construction, which is what I'd been in. And my dad's dad was in construction, so I had a lot of exposure to it. And between my sophomore and junior year, my dad was diagnosed with cancer, went in to have a biopsy done. It's supposed to be a little outpatient thing. And man, you know, they roll him out, they roll him right back in. Surgeon comes in and goes, "Hey, we opened you up to take this biopsy, but when we opened you up, man, it's everywhere." And 6 months later, he was gone.
How old are you at this point?
I was I was 21. No, let's see. Yeah, I was 21. My dad was 40. He died
That's
at 40.
tough, man.
He was 19 when I was born. So I was 21. He was, or I was about to turn 21, I guess, and he was 40. And so I had a younger brother that's, he was 13 years old. And my mom just really kind of, they were incredibly close, and she just didn't take it really well. And so, man, the schooling and the ability to do all that, I just had to make a hard decision. And so immediately at my dad's funeral, I had a family friend that said he owned a big construction company, and he said, "Hey, if you need to go to work, I got a place for you." And so I took a job with him in construction, and he made me an assistant superintendent. And 3 weeks, he put me under the best superintendent construction mind I'd ever been under. The guy was amazing. But he was the biggest hard ass I've ever been around. And I would wake up at night screaming, nightmares. He had me so rattled. And I couldn't reach him, but he was a hunter. And I walked in his trailer one day and I said, "You ever been bear hunting?" He said, "No." I said, "I know how to bear hunt. I know where to bear hunt. Do you want to go?" He said, "Yep." And so we went bear hunting that spring, and we became like the closest. He just passed last year. And we were like the guy that I thought was in my nightmares every night that I would never win. Hunting made us really close. But anyway, long story short, I worked for him, under him on one of his jobs for 3 weeks. And the owner pulled up one day and said, "Broderick, hop in the truck." He drove me over across town to this giant lot, a huge mud hole. There was a job trailer there and this big muddy hole full of water. And he hands me this giant roll of plans. And he said, "I'm in a bind. We've got too many jobs and not enough people. This one's a disaster already. This is an insurance company. This is their home office. I need you to build it." And so 21 years old, like I said, everything comes the hard way. I was forced into it. And I did it. And 5 years later, I started my own business. And my first 3 clients were the 3 partners in that insurance company, the first job I ever did. Yeah, they hired me to do homes for them. And so, and a salon for one of the other one's wives. So,
Quick question of clarification on that, because I think there's an important lesson here for the younger guys listening, because this is something I've experienced myself. You have people who go into a workplace and they like kind of exist. And then you have people who go into the workplace and they get recognized right away as having that star quality. What are some of the lessons you've learned in life about being that guy who gets the shot? Like, what were some of the things that you were thinking about or doing that would have even allowed those men to have faith in what was kind of still a boy at the time and give you something that was kind of up above your pay grade at the time?
Well, it's funny. I've always had those kind of opportunities, and I really can't put my finger on it other than the way that I try to lead.
Okay.
And the way I've always tried to teach my boys. And it's basically your example should be what you do, not what you say.
Right.
And your actions are just everything. And I think that if people see what you're doing and they don't hear what you're doing, it stands out loudly against the crowd. And for me, like, I've always just been, I guess, old beyond my years.
Right.
I've never seen age or experience as a barrier in anything. And I mean, when there's something that I've wanted to learn how to do, I've just taught myself how to do it. And so business and hunting success are so commensurate. The attributes that give you success are so commensurate with each other, because it's all you got to do is just be willing to do the hard shit, man.
Right.
That's it. And people say, "Well, what's your niche?" My niche is doing stuff nobody ever wanted to do. That's it. And it's those things that are always going to be successful for you, and avoiding those hard things is what's going to be the limit to your success. So, man, I just think letting your actions speak is the way for young guys to get the shot. What I see now, I've seen it with my kids. I've seen it with, their generation. There's always somebody to blame. And we wrap that crap up really fast around our house. When my son's like, the coach doesn't like me, I should be playing over this guy. I said, bud, all you got to do is put him in a position where he can't afford not to play you.
Thank you.
It's easy.
The word I've fallen in love with lately is undeniable.
Yeah.
Because one of my hobbies is bodybuilding, and I've retired from it now, but it's a very subjective sport. And it's in the hands of the judges. There's no way to take it out of the hands of the judges. And you hear the pros talking about, you got to get to a point where you're undeniable. Like they just have no choice but to put you in first place. And I've started putting that same attitude into my the way I approach hunting. Like I am going literally insane with scouting this year because I keep finding myself booking all these crazy epic adventure hunts, 15-day fly-ins. Like I've never been there before. I show up, I spend the first 10 days just figuring out what's going on, and I'm moderately successful at the end of the year, but I'm not having the years that I want, and I've realized that it's the lack of preparation, and I need to approach it with that. I am just going to put so much work and effort, and I'm going to learn areas to such a fine granular detail that I will literally have no choice but to go out there and be successful once the season opens. So I love that message from you, that it's like, yeah, if you put it in the hands of the decision makers, you're always going to be vulnerable to the fact that they just don't choose you. But if you become so good or make the decision so clear that they have no choice but to choose you, it's just such a more successful approach. I love it.
It is. And, it seems like everything in my life has been that way. Like I mentioned earlier, I boxed when I was younger, and, when you're doing younger stuff, it's a subjective sport where you've got guys,
Yep. Point system, judges, the whole 9 yards.
Yeah.
Yep.
But there's one way to take it out of their hands.
Yes, sir.
Knock their ass out.
Yeah.
And so you take you create your own success, and you take matters into your own hands. And so, outside of my wife, my parents, my grandparents, pretty much at the end of that list, it's a very short list, I've just never felt like I could rely on anybody but myself.
Right.
And hunting's the same way. Like I've done quite a few, guided hunts. Most of my stuff has been on my own, do-it-yourself type public land stuff. But some of the guided hunts I've been on, I don't trust the guides. I don't trust the outfitters. I don't take their word as gospel. I never have. I question everything. And I always prepare, even when I'm going on a guided hunt. I want to know where we're hunting.
Right.
I want to see the maps. I want to know the boundaries. I want to know everything before we get there, because I've been on plenty of hunts to where they shove you in a truck with some dudes, chain smoking Marlboro Reds, riding around looking for deer or whatever. And, shit, this ain't gonna work.
Yeah.
I got to change the game. I remember the one guided elk hunt that I've ever been on was back in 2010 or 11. And I had a lot of friends that wanted to elk hunt. I had some family that wanted to elk hunt. There was a group of 6, including myself. And these guys had been just pounding me, pestering me to go. And they're not the kind of guys. So there's hunters and there's guys that like to hunt. And there's a distinct difference, right? These are guys that like to hunt.
Yep.
And so I knew that if I took these guys public land elk hunting the way I did it, it was not going to be successful for either of us. Mm-hmm. And I had hunted a really thin little strip of public between these 2 ranches, and been very successful in there, killing bulls every year, usually within the first 2 or 3 days, like a mile from the truck on this little sliver of public, And And I killed a bull, and the damn thing ran over this ridge and over into this basin on this private ranch. It's like, oh man, this is not good. And so I had to pack out and drive all the way around to the other side of the mountain to get into their gate. And I went to their gate and it was locked. And I was sitting there trying to decide what to do. And I was going to get out and walk to their headquarters. And I thought, man, if these are not good people and I'm walking in there, this could be a bad deal. And I'm sitting there trying to decide what to do. And here comes the owner and a couple of her guys coming out of the gate. They were headed to town. And they had a couple of elk in the back of this big flatbed. And I told them what had happened. And they said, oh, well, do you know where he is? And I said, yeah, here's where he is. And I showed them on the map. And they said, oh, well, that's just right down this road. Just follow us. We'll take you down there and let you get him out. And so I followed them down, and they helped me pack that elk out of that.
Love it.
Yeah. And so I said, do you guys do guided hunts? And they said, yeah, we just took our first 2 archery hunters this week. This is their bulls.
Okay.
We have done rifle hunts, but this is our first 2 archery hunts. And I said, how much are your hunts? And they said, this isn't 2010, but it's still cheap as hell. They said $3,500, which is a very cheap elk hunt, even back then.
Yeah.
And that's lodging.
Especially on private. That's crazy.
And this place is like special private.
Yeah.
I've been watching elk on this thing for years. And so I said, how many hunters can you take? They said 6. I said, okay, I want the last week of September, 6 hunters. I'm going to write you a check right now for the whole thing. And they said, okay. I just knew these were great people.
Yeah.
And so I was on the way home and I called my uncle and all the friends that wanted to go. And I said, okay, guys, there's 5 spots. Yeah. I've paid for it. When I'm going to be home in 3 days, whoever has the checks in my mailbox is who's going. And so anyway, long story short, the next year, the 6 of us go to this ranch and we meet the guides. And we hunt the first day, the first morning, and we come back to camp. And I pulled my guys outside and I said, this ain't gonna work. We don't have guides. These are not elk killers. We're not gonna kill them. We're gonna have to either make these people really mad and do our own thing, or get really lucky and hopefully they're understanding. And so I went and talked to the lady, the owner, and I just said, listen, archery is different. And this place is phenomenal, but we're not going to do it with these guys. And she was open and she goes, what do you suggest? And I said, let's get in the truck right now. And I need to see all the water on this ranch. I need to see every drop. And she said, okay. And so we jumped in the truck and we rode till almost 5, 6 o'clock that evening, looking at water holes. And, we went and set up blinds on those water holes because there's just no way we were going to kill elk with those guides. One of them one of them was like 75, 80 years old. He could barely move. Anyway, long story short, one of the other guides had never killed an elk and never skinned an elk. So that was on a Monday. And so we went and set up blinds on some of these water holes that I saw. Some of them were like primo. And Tuesday we killed 6 bulls. 6 for 6 on Tuesday. And we had to spend the next 2 days getting bulls out of canyons and dragging them out and tracking them. And it was a shit show. But they were appreciative. Right. They said, we get it. Bow hunting's different. But that is a very long version of taking matters into your own hands and not relying on someone else for your success. Yeah. Because most people, if they wouldn't have had my abrasive personality, probably would have just gone with the flow and maybe killed 1 or 2 bulls, got lucky, and they would have just been okay with it. And that's just never good enough. And they've never done that again. They've never tagged out in a week. We did it in a day. I still have the picture of all the bulls. But anyway, that was in 2010, I believe. It was 14 years later. They take 4 weeks of archery hunters, 6 guys a week. So that's 24 hunters. I bet you 18 to 20 of them are still descendants or people associated with that first trip. It's all people I know and people they know. That group has basically taken that ranch over for archery season. I've never been back. Not that I wouldn't. It's just that I like hunting on my own.
Yeah.
You know. So, but anyway, I just feel like, you know, you've got to control your own destiny, and man, you know that.
Yep.
I mean, you've had to make hard decisions, and you know, nobody's going to do it for you, right?
No, definitely not.
So anyway, with day 6, it's the same way. I got tricked into it. I got backed into it. I had a friend in Australia, still a dear friend. He was here a few weeks ago. He's a buffalo outfitter over there on the Coburg Peninsula in Australia. And he's like me. He's just always wanting to find that perfect arrow setup. And so in 2014, he started producing arrows and components. He sent some to me. I built my own components because his were kind of rubbish. And so then when he came over elk hunting with me, he's like, dang, mate, yours are way better than mine. Let's do this together. And so that's kind of the genesis of day 6. It started in, you know, the territories in Australia, and trying to find an arrow to shoot through buffalo and stuff like that. And we got ready to roll with it, and he just called me one night and said, man, my heart's not in this. I know it's going to take away from my guiding business, and I want to build the most legitimate outfitting business in Australia, and I can't do both. And I said, okay. He goes, you just take it and go. And so I kind of it was just like backed into it by happenstance. And I had a very successful business at the time. I'd been in for 25 years, and I, you know, asked my wife, and she's like, you got to do it. You got to do it. This is what you need to be doing. I asked my boys, and they're like, Dad, you got to do it. This is what you need to be doing. But I was struggling with it, you know, and so it's scary, you know, 45 years old, starting something new. And we were at the church for my son's high school graduation, and I was just trying to make a decision on what to do. And each family had their own table, and on the table they had like a little bag of different things there for us. And the pastor said, hey, I want you to pull the first thing out of the bag, and we're going to talk about this for your young people. And the first thing that we pulled out of the bag was a wooden arrow. And I looked over at my wife and my kids, and they were just smiling, and they just went, here we go. Yeah. So that's kind of how day 6 was born. It was just like pure, you know, just pure chance. And I'm very glad that I did it. It is by far the most rewarding thing I've ever done. I love helping guys become more successful. And I feel like we're helping guys become more successful in spite of the hunting industry. Right. And I feel like that's kind of where we've gotten with all this. And so once we get people here, they don't leave. Our customers stay. And because I think they can really tell that we're genuine in this business, and what we want to do is really see guys become more successful, because shit, bow hunting's hard.
It's real hard, man.
It's hard. It's the hardest thing you can do.
Talk to me a little bit about the design philosophy behind day 6, because we've got heavy arrows, we've got light arrows, we've got extreme FOC. There's a lot of different camps that can all kind of bend the laws of physics to support their own particular ideologies. But what would you say?
You mean trust the science?
Yeah, exactly. So what would you say is the kind of guiding design principles behind day 6 in regards to the approach that you take for designing arrows, broadheads, and components?
So you basically have your baseline or your sample size. And that for me is a giant pile of bodies over the last 35 years.
Yep.
And understanding what an arrow and broadhead is supposed to do by shooting a high volume of arrows and broadheads through animals. And so the basis of this is growing up in the South, where you have a 4-month season. When I grew up, you could kill a buck and a doe a day. So
That's
you
crazy.
could, yes, sir.
That's
And then
that's a lot of deer.
and then you had hogs, which are the single greatest thing in the world for testing what an arrow and broadhead is supposed to do. They're the hardest thing to kill with a bow.
Okay.
Big hogs for sure. And so that was a year-round endeavor as well. So having the ability just geographically where I lived to hunt year-round and see what an arrow and a broadhead is supposed to do, and then at age 19, I actually killed my first bear in New Brunswick at 17. I missed the first week of high school to go bear hunting. Told my principal it was an educational trip.
Well, you didn't lie. You might,
I,
bent the truth a
yeah,
little bit, but I think there's some.
yeah.
It's not.
He was part of our church, so he knew I was full of shit anyway. So, but anyway, elk hunting at 19 before the technology screwed us up, and learning things the hard way. Man, it's just a lifetime of experience doing it as hard as you can go. I mean, my whole life I've worked so I could bow hunt. I mean, that's it. And so anyway, having that baseline and that sample size to understand where you could just basically say, I've seen every scenario. And then having an engineering mind and being in a field like construction my entire life, where you have to understand engineering and understand, structural properties, things like that, support, continuous flow, connectivity for structural integrity, things like that. It just, those two things blended together to kind of make the perfect monster to understand what it's supposed to be. And so when I was in high school, and then in my first 2 years of college, I worked at a hunting and fishing store. So in the 80s and early 90s, I was working and running this archery shop in the hunting and fishing store. So I got to see like the modern bow, the modern compound, the modern broadhead and arrow, all that kind of come to life, which was so valuable. And so it's just been such a big part of my life. So when you go to design an arrow and a broadhead, a lot of times you don't even have to do the testing to understand that, heck, this isn't going to work. I've already seen this. I've seen this at a high level. So, let's do a good example. The high FOC single bevel stuff, all that crap. I bought into it. I was a trad guy in the 90s. And I shot a trad bow from 92 to 2007 exclusively, 15 years. So when the Ashby stuff came out, I was like, oh, look at all these pages. It's got to be right.
Yep.
Look at all these words. It's got to be right.
He's a doctor.
So, yeah, he's a doctor. So anyway, I bought into that hook, line, and sinker and got to see the benefits, but I also got to see the negative aspects of it. And then I started, as I got older, a little wiser, and then my brain started to develop a little more as far as an engineering mind. I realized, like, there's no way the single bevel stuff rotates. The ratios are so far off. Like, there's no way that little tiny amount of bevel is going to rotate, create rotation. It's impossible. If that's the case, an airplane would have a fuselage that's 80% wide and 20% wings. Right. Well, that's not how it works. So I knew right then, this is horseshit. And then, when you're shooting 40 or 50 hogs a year, you're having to just recycle arrows constantly. What I saw is that you had to resharpen those things every single time, like start to finish. You had to start over because the edge was so weak. So I realized then that wasn't the head that I wanted. I've always been a two-blade guy. I like that style.
Yep.
But that single bevel edge, that's just kind of horse crap. And then when I started shooting stick bows and started building my own stick bows and started trying to tune stick bows, I realized a light bulb goes off why Ashby had better results and more success with high FOC. I'm not questioning the results. What I'm questioning is the cause. He was shooting a 80 something pound self bow in most of those tests.
Yep.
That bow was not, the riser wasn't even cut to center, which a lot of stick bows are not cut to center or past center. And so if you could imagine that, the arrow can't go straight. It has to go around. Okay. So as a stick bow guy, when I started building my first bows, they weren't going past center shot. And I was having to load the front of the arrow up with weight to get that arrow to paradox or flex and time it where it would flex around that shelf, around that riser. And I got better arrow flight. And that is the key to all of this crap is arrow flight.
Right.
All this other stuff, like arrow flight is 95% of it. The other 5% is what all the goobers on the internet argue over. They're focusing on the 5 and ignoring the 95. And so I realized then Ashby got better penetration because when he loaded the front of his arrow up, he got better arrow flight because he had a bow that wasn't cut past center. And that's what got him better penetration. Listen, an arrow doesn't have an engine. So you can't put the weight on the front and it pull the arrow through.
Yeah.
The only engine is the bow. You have one source of energy. That's it. And so with regards to penetration, or let's say a momentum calculation, the disbursement or the location of the weight is not a factor. If it was, it would be a factor in the calculation, but it's not. It's not a component. So it doesn't matter where the distribution of the weight is. So those are the kind of things that through experience, the light bulb would go off and I'd realize, okay, so what's the downside to it? Well, the downside for me that I saw, especially when you translate the high FOC stuff to a modern compound, is that tail wagging.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Any types of crosswinds, things like that. That's why you see all these guys barely putting any vanes on the back, because you got to realize that when you're changing FOC from 10 to 30, you're going to see a difference. And what happens is if that arrow is flying at an angle, going towards the target, the point may still hit on the target, but your knock's going to be downwind left or right. That's not what you want. No. The simple key to this is having the knock directly behind the head. That's what gives you penetration. So, but here's the good thing. The good thing is that you hear people talk about FOC more than anything for whatever reason. I guess this is what people talk about. But from 0% to 20%, the effects of trajectory, penetration, any of that, it's not measurable. It is absolutely not measurable. So it is a colossal waste of time to be able to even focus in on it. If you ask Levi Morgan what his FOC is, his answer will be, I couldn't tell you.
Yep.
Because it doesn't matter. Now, the greatest shooter in the world that's ever lived probably doesn't care what his FOC is. So why is everyone on the internet talking about it? It doesn't make any sense. And I understand it from a kind of a engineering perspective. If you had an 80% FOC arrow, you'd have something. Because what you're doing now is you're taking the arrow completely out of play, like a dart.
Or even I think we start to border on crossbow bolts and stuff too, because it would give you the ability to have almost a non-existent shaft, and then you wouldn't have to worry about the friction that would be created of a 30-inch shaft not being in line with the hole that was cut on the way in, slowing your penetration. Right. So I do think if you take it way to the other, now we're talking about a bullet is what we're talking about, basically.
That's right.
If you take FOC to the infinite, you have a bullet, not an arrow. Yeah,
and that's what I'm trying to say.
Yes.
Yeah. It's not that it's not a real thing. It is.
Yeah.
But it's not achievable as it pertains to archery.
And I do think when you start getting to so I used to run the Valkyrie system for a couple years. I really tried that system, and I was shooting an 80-pound Pro Defiant 34. Could not get that thing to tune for the life of me. Could never get my field points and broadheads to hit. I literally had to have two sight settings on my sight. I had field point settings, and then I used little whiteout pen on all the little areas that I would have to change it when I went to my hunt so that my broadheads would hit where they were supposed to hit. Now, that thing hit like a Mack truck. And those broadheads did damage. I'm not going to deny that. But what I could never get was straight arrow flight. It was always head here, tail over here. And that's why.
Not a good thing.
No, it's not. And that was why my field points and my broadheads would never line up, because it was happening to a lesser degree with the field points than it was with the broadheads, because the broadheads would create that additional drag and give me an even greater
steering
discrepancy, 100%. Yeah. And so that was my first signal that, okay, this extreme FOC, like I have a pretty decent education. I took calculus and physics in university. I can understand some pretty fundamental scientific principles. I understand the arguments the extreme FOC guys are making. Like, people always use the baseball with the string attached as an example. Like, I'm going to throw a baseball, and I'm like, yeah, but if you look at that string, it's going to be whipping all over the place. And that's exactly what the tail of the arrow does. And that's the problem when it hits the target, is that it's not proceeding through the exact hole that was cut by the broadhead upon entry. But that was my experience. And I don't want to badmouth that system. I also think a lot of this stuff works for some people in trad setups. And when you start getting to the more powerful, faster compound setups, some of the rules also don't apply. But that was my first experience where I'm like, okay, I understand technically why they say this extreme FOC stuff works, but in practical experience, this is not working for me.
It's going to work for a trad guy that's having to shoot around a shelf.
Yeah.
So listen, they're all about the science, and they have pages and pages and millions of words. None of that stuff, all these years that they've been, this stuff's been around 30, 40 years.
Yeah.
35 years now, I guess. Why is there not a definitive, huge 1,000-page report that's done in the modern times with a compound? Why have they never done it over all these years? They still are relying on that old stuff from the 80s and 90s.
Yeah.
Because they've done the tests with the compounds, I guarantee you, and there's no measurable difference. I've done it. I have the analytical mind. I built 3 arrows, 10%, 20%, 30%, identical weights, perfectly tuned, went through, did all the penetration calculations, 0 difference in penetration over 10, 20, and 30 with identical arrows with perfect arrow flight. It's just, it's arrow flight is everything. That's what you've got to focus on. The other thing that it's super important, and this is what I learned in the construction industry, is sidewall friction. And you've probably never heard another person in archery talk about that or say that term. But that is where that arrow flight and sidewall friction, those are the 2 things you got to focus on. And sidewall friction is, you know what a piling is, like a post or a pillar that you would use to support a pier or a wharf or a platform or a house on stilts. So people think that when you come out and do a soil test that you're drilling down until you find something solid for the butt end of that post or piling to sit on to hold up. And that's not what it is at all. What it is they're doing the soil test to determine the consistency and the makeup of that soil, to know how much tension that soil is going to put on the sides of that post or piling. That is sidewall friction. The bottom of the post has nothing to do with it. The bottom of the post could be in water. But if the material... Exactly.
Well, and if you think about it as a function of surface area, it's like an order of magnitude less. That you'd be placing an unbelievable amount of weight on an
8-inch circle.
Yeah, which is just ridiculous. But if you think about the gripping power of that friction through a 50-foot piling that's been drilled down, multiplied by the circumference of the piling itself. Yeah, that's very interesting.
So that is what holds these things.
Right.
And that is what restricts an arrow from passing through different types of media or matter on an animal. So listen, I'm just a good old boy from the South that has just been obsessive with my hunting and been very irresponsible in life. I've put hunting over everything else. And
join the club, my friend.
Yeah. And so when that light bulb goes off, when I understood from the engineering side, the sidewall friction, I thought, I don't have to reinvent the wheel here. I just need to pop a bigger hole than what the arrow is. So if you pop a bigger hole at the front of the arrow, everything behind it, there's not going to be any sidewall friction.
Yep, zero drag.
Yeah. And so everybody has gone into these collars they're calling them impact collars, and they're calling them all this other stuff for durability. Shit, that's not what I did it for.
Right.
I did it to pop a bigger hole. So everything behind it was smaller. Now, when you have the industry standard arrow that has the minimum amount of material possible in it to achieve proper spine, everybody's seen the end of their arrows mushroom on an impact.
Yep.
So there is a benefit for it there. Our shafts, our HD shafts, if you look at our sidewalls and like the material that we put in our shafts, it's twice as much. You don't need that. We have it because it's overkill, but we have it more for a small diameter heavy wall arrow and a larger hole with the collar. So you're basically popping a bigger hole and running a tiny shaft behind it and having zero sidewall friction. That's how you get 2 holes. And for me, 2 holes is everything. You got to have the drain plug. It's got to. It's the arrow has got to be out. And so, man, it's just a really simple approach to what we do. Just simplicity carried to the extreme becomes perfection, and that's what we live by here.
Right.
And the other thing is, you know, like I mentioned, shooting a bunch of hogs and deer when you're younger in Alabama. Hell, I couldn't afford to buy arrows all the time and broadheads all the time. So I needed stuff that was durable. But the hunting industry has always viewed an arrow and a broadhead in the same light as ammunition.
Right.
They viewed it as a disposable. Once you shoot it and use it, it's done. And it's not that way. It doesn't have to be that way. So that's the other approach that we took, is to make the arrow and the broadhead reusable, not disposable. I mean, if you looked at my quiver, you'd laugh. I mean, my stuff is beat up. I don't have, like, I can't take a glamour shot of my bow and my fancy color-coded sight and my color-coded stabilizer and my perfectly built pretty arrows. You couldn't do that with mine. Mine looked more like a crackhead's mug shot than a glamour shot. My stuff's beat up. You know, the paint's beat up off my bows, and my stuff gets used. And so, but that's what I want. I want the arrows that are reusable. I want broadheads that are reusable. That's why they can't rust.
Right.
It's just
so
common
talk
sense.
to me a little bit about weight, because much like with FOC, we have extreme camps on both ends. We have like super light, fast guys, super heavy, you know, momentum guys. Where would you say the general philosophy on weight lies with the Day 6 system?
So for me, it's not as much the weight of the arrow just as it pertains to its momentum and penetration. It also, which I understood a long time ago, is incredibly important. The weight of the arrow is incredibly important for the efficiency of the bow. And that gets glossed over a lot. So when you look at the modern bow manufacturing industry, the only measurable they have is speed, right? They can't advertise how quiet this bow is with a numerical, you know what I'm saying?
Yep.
Value, a numerical value. The only numerical value they can add is speed.
Yep.
So there's 0 to 60 as it pertains to like the car industry. So,
which is why it's insane that IBO speeds are represented from a 350 grain arrow. Because like, what individual in anywhere is shooting a 350 grain? You'd have it's difficult to build one these days that's 350 grains.
It is, and so the IBO speed stuff is kind of a farce. But you know, if you look at it, the bow manufacturers are the nucleus of the archery industry, and then everything kind of orbits around that.
Yep.
And so the arrow manufacturers and broadhead manufacturers and everything, they kind of follow that path, and they kind of follow that lead of, okay, light, fast to keep these speeds up. The problem is the bows are not designed to be efficient at IBO weighted arrows and IBO speeds. So when you shoot a bow with, say, an IBO rated arrow and you shoot it at 340 feet per second, what you're doing is you're putting, let's say that the bow is 70 pounds. Well, let's just call that 70 pounds horsepower. Let's say it's a 70 horsepower engine. So when you shoot an IBO weighted arrow at 340, you're putting 50 horsepower into the arrow, and then the other 20 horsepower is getting wasted and it's going back into the bow in the form of vibration and noise because the arrow is too light to absorb 70 horsepower. It's like having the proper gear on the rear end of your car or the proper prop on your boat. You have a fixed amount of horsepower and you're trying to achieve maximum performance. That arrow is your gear, basically. And so as you raise the weight of that arrow, what you're doing is you're allowing the bow to put all 70 horsepower into that arrow. And it's a real simple thing to proof and to fact check, because let's say that you have a bow that's shooting a 400 grain arrow, 300 feet per second. Okay.
Yep.
And then you bump to a 500 grain arrow. So you've just raised your overall weight 25%. So if the bow was already functioning at max efficiency, then your velocity should drop by 25%, correct?
Yes.
Yes. So you should go from 300 to, let's see, that would be 75 feet per second.
Yep.
So you should go from 300 to 225. But you only go from 300 to 260. You see what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
You've only dropped 10 or 12 feet per second. That tells you that the bow was not using all of its energy already. If it was, it would drop the weight. The speed drop would be commensurate with the mass increase. So what you're doing is you're finding that sweet spot. And that, for us, with most modern bows, is about 8 grains per pound on a 30-inch draw guy. So that would be a 70-pound bow. If you were 30-inch draw, your perfect arrow would be 560.
Okay.
And that way you're getting all the horsepower out of the bow delivered into the arrow. Your bow is efficient, it's quiet, and it's a perfectly tuned engine. As you drop in draw weight, the bow drops in efficiency.
Right.
So everybody knows that. Everybody hates the guy with a 30-inch draw. So that number will drop as well. So like if you're, say, 70 pounds, but you're shooting a 27-inch draw, probably be in that 500 grain range, like 20 grains per inch on draw weight. So that's kind of how we look at what a perfectly weighted arrow is. And so you're getting max efficiency out of your bow. You have a good average mass. And what that heavier arrow is going to do is not just penetrate better just because of its mass. It's also going to be more forgiving in the field in hunting situations. A heavier, slower arrow is going to be more forgiving with a fixed blade head. It's going to be more forgiving when you torque your bow in a hunting situation, when you're shooting uphill or downhill or out of a tree. When you're shooting like these super light, fast arrow setups, they're not forgiving.
No.
It's the difference in driving your car at 65 and driving it at 125. You can barely hang on to it at 125, but at 65, you can steer it with one finger. That correlates over to an arrow. Slow it down a little bit, add a little bit more mass. It's gonna correct. It's not gonna come out of your bow wonky if you torque. It's not gonna be as susceptible to crosswinds, debris impact, shooting through grass. It's a hunting arrow. It's a real world hunting arrow. And so, but what the industry has done is they've kept pushing us down this speed hole, the speed, chasing speed, because that's what the bow manufacturers, that's the only thing they can measure. And
I do think there's an argument from the 3D and the Target guys too, because for them, a forgiving setup would be being able to be out 2 or 3 yards and still hit a 10 ring. And I think at
That's why I
distance,
say hunting arrows, though.
100%. And that's why we got to talk to
Yeah,
the right people for the right piece
that's
of
right.
gear. What I find incredibly interesting is that I always knew okay, all things else being equal, a heavier arrow will be quieter. What I never put together was the fact that it was the excess energy being dissipated as noise. Because I'm familiar, as we all are, who took grade 9 science class, that you can't destroy energy, you can only transform it. And in most systems, it would come out as heat. A light bulb. Why does it get hot? Because it's not a 100% efficient system. So it's exuding the extra energy as heat instead
Excess.
of light.
Right.
And it never clicked until you said that for me. That's what that noise is on the bow. It is because there's no
Excess.
other physics or mathematical explanation for why. It's not like there's nothing mechanically impacting anything else that would
Correct.
happen differently with a lighter or heavier arrow. It's just the fact that more of the energy has been transferred into the arrow, leaving less in the bow to be exuded as noise. That's incredibly interesting.
So now you've got the other side of the spectrum that you asked about, which is the super heavy arrows, the 600, 650 grain stuff. It's the exact same premise.
Right. We're going past that optimal.
We're overloading the bow now. It's
Yeah.
like putting a super tall gear in your car. You can't get it to take off.
Yeah.
Putting a super tall prop on your boat. You can't get out of the hole.
Yeah.
Right. So anyway, it's the same thing. It's finding that optimum gear, which is the optimum weight arrow. So you're making your bow as efficient as possible. And you're in the middle of the road. You're not too light. You're not too heavy. That bow is going to be efficient. It's going to deliver the best cast that it can be. It's with the perfect trajectory for the right amount of weight. It's not going to have too much fall in a trajectory from being a 600, 650 grain arrow, but it's also not going to be too light and unforgiving and susceptible to interference as a light arrow. The other thing that has to be discussed is shed velocity. So with a light arrow, it's going to be faster to a certain point, and then the middle of the road arrow is going to catch it, and then it's going to maintain its energy and velocity further. So if you took a 400 grain arrow and you had your dial set out to 100 yards, okay? And let's say that you take your sight tape and you measure from 0 to 100 yards, and let's just say it's 2 inches, okay? If you take a 500 grain arrow and you do a sight tape out to 100 yards, it'll be 0 to 100 will be like 1 3/4 inches. Your heavier arrow will actually be less to a certain point, and then you pass that point of diminishing return where you get to the super heavy stuff. So it's the equivalent of throwing a ping pong ball and a golf ball. They're the exact same size objects. You can't throw a ping pong ball more than 20 feet and it just settles to the ground because it's too light and it sheds velocity. You can throw a golf ball out of sight because it's got mass to maintain that velocity. So it's a ballistic coefficient, if you will, just like for a rifle, working up loads for a rifle. So what you're trying to do is find that happy medium to where, you're going to have that perfect balance of everything the bow needs, everything the arrow needs, and everything you need to get 2 holes penetrating through animals. It's not really hard when you think about it. It's just the industry puts out so much horse shit. It's hard for people to weed through it all and figure out what's fact from fiction. And
I
then
also
you
think
have
people are looking for magic pills. I got
That's
a
a
big
great
background
point.
in nutrition and fitness. And I find anything that pops up on the extremes, I almost automatically discount because it's like, let's look at the carnivore diet. I'm not going to say meat's not bad, but you're going to have a tough time convincing me that it is healthy to eat nothing but meat for the rest of your life. I feel the same way about keto. I feel anything on the extremes that promises disproportionate results for smaller amounts of effort, whether that be in a weapon system, a diet system, a workout system, I'm immediately skeptical of. In my experience in life, Most of the results kind of happen up the middle in the more moderate areas. Do you know what I mean? And just require a little bit more effort. And I do find that arrow design is the same way. Like people want to think if I just put, 25, 30% FOC, I'm not going to have to tune my bow and I'm not going to, they don't admit that to themselves, but the driving force behind that is, if I find this magic pill, I'm not going to have to work as hard in some other areas. And I just don't see that playing out in reality.
Well, it's funny you mentioned that. I know people have heard me say this a million times that have taught with us. I say, this is not a magic bean. We're not selling a magic bean here. We're just selling what is basically what day 6 is what I want, and we're making extra for others to buy. And I may be right, I may be wrong, but it's been very successful to me, and this is what we're going with. With regards to broadheads, our broadheads are so simple. They are so simple. And that's why nobody else makes the exact head that we do. Well, I guess the last couple of years we've had some people start making them now, but they are so simple. The designs and the geometry of them have been around for ages. But people have not made exactly what we make because it's just so simple. And the industry goes away from that. They try to create that magic bean with the next gadget. And, it's just, it blew me away that in 2010 or 12, I was having to buy my broadheads in Hungary because no one here was making the exact head that I wanted. And our stuff is simple. But everything was just so convoluted, or they had it just about right. And then they'd stick a bleeder on the back and stick it straight out, like as an afterthought. I mean, there was just all this little stuff that just, and then, for the most part, they're building them out of materials that are readily available overseas. And you can't really get the quality that you want or the quality control when you're doing that.
Talk to me a little bit about your fixed blade versus mechanical, because I think this is another area that's kind of like magic pill prone. And there's a lot of great guys that shoot mechanicals. I'm a fixed blade guy personally, but I'd be interested, based on your level of experience, what your learnings have been in regards to those two different philosophies.
So, as I mentioned earlier, I'm 51 years old, killed my first archery deer at age 12. And I can proudly say I've never shot a mechanical head, not once in my life. But it seems like everyone that has ever hunted with me has always shot mechanical heads. And up until the last few years, I had a pretty good disdain for them. But I just saw the failures, and then just by their nature, how they're made, that their mechanisms basically force a weak body and head. They have to be extremely long for what they do. They have 3 blades, so most of the ferrules are made out of a very weak, light aluminum material just to make weight. Everything about them is just flimsy in my mind. And I wanted nothing to do with them. But here's what I'll say that I've learned over the last few years as my experience with day 6 has taught me some of these lessons. There's very few people that are going to commit themselves to the hard work of tuning their bow to where they can accurately shoot fixed blade heads. And that's just a hard fact. It's a reality. And some people their life doesn't lend them the luxury of time to do it. And some guys just don't have the understanding. Some guys just don't have the ability to shoot accurately. There's a reason there's the guys at the top that are so good in archery. And then the rest of us peons, So So there is a place for a mechanical head as it pertains to accuracy. And it doesn't matter how reliable or how good the penetration is on a high quality fixed blade head. If it's not going to hit where you're aiming, it's a moot point.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, there's definitely a place for one. And I think there's a lot of people that shoot fixed blade heads that probably shouldn't be. And then there's a lot of guys that are shooting mechanicals that probably shouldn't be. They have the ability to shoot a fixed blade head accurately and have a safer plan. But there's definitely a place for it. Here's the problem. Most of them are not made with durability in mind. They just almost can't make them durable because of their nature. They're also the way that most of these mechanisms work and how they're designed, they rob so much energy and they create so much resistance after they're opened.
Right.
So like you said earlier about the energy part, it's just basic physics that for a broadhead to open, for blades to open, however which way it opens, it has to tax that energy to open from the moving arrow. That's the only place that the energy source is available. Mm-hmm. So you're robbing the arrow of valuable energy to open the mechanism. The real problem I have with them is once they're open, I almost look at all the mechanical broadheads and go, have any of these people that are making them ever hunted? Ever? Have they ever shot an arrow through a deer? Because the blades stick straight out. And you lose such an advantage when you stick the blade straight out like that. You create so much resistance to where, number one, the blade cannot slice anymore. It has to chop. Mm-hmm. And when it chops, it's just dragging. And it also is dulling the blade so fast. But if you took a knife and put it over your finger, it would take an incredible amount of force to push that knife straight down and cut through your finger. If you took that same knife and set the blade on your top of your finger and just let the weight of the knife be the only weight, but just pulled it back and draw it across your finger, it's going to slice it right to the bone. Because that's what blades are designed to do, is slice, not chop. So all of these mechanicals, they're opening up to get these crazy wound channels, but they're just killing penetration. You can't get an exit hole. If they encounter any type of resistance at all, high density muscle, cartilage, sinew, bone, they're stopped. They're done. They can't continue forward. So, and there's not a single one of them out there that has a just average blade angle once they're deployed. So those are the two problems I have with them. The durability, just by the nature of their design, and the blade angles once deployed are atrocious. But is that better or worse than having a guy trying to shoot a fixed blade that can't shoot a 1 foot group at 30 yards?
Yeah.
I don't know. That's a hard one, man. I almost feel like the guy that either can't tune his bow or can't shoot accurately or doesn't have the time probably needs to shoot one just so he can hit where the vitals are and hopefully get far enough in there to have a mortal wound.
Yeah, that was my exact experience. So I live in Vancouver, BC. We have a couple bow shops. Everybody knows I think they're garbage. They're both target-based shops. I bought a bow at one, didn't even paper tune it or group tune it or nothing. Because they're all just shooting field points. They have no idea what a hunter needs. I had a Pro Defiant 34, which is kind of a known finicky bow. You end up yoke tuning it and doing a bunch of stuff. And there's about a year and a half of my archery career where I was walking around with a bow that wasn't tuned. I did not possess the technical proficiency to tune it, and there wasn't a bow shop available here to tune it. I started using mechanical heads. And for that year and a half, I will say, given the circumstances I was presented with, that was the best option that I had at my disposal.
Sure.
After that, I went obsessive like I normally do, bought a bow press, set up a bow shop in my own house, learned how to tear that bow down to its base components and put it back together, and had that thing tuned unbelievably well, and then went back to a more moderate system with a fixed blade double bevel system. And that bow after that shot better than I ever had, and I never had any use for the mechanicals. I do think there's an outlying case that I'm starting to experiment with. I think there's a very skilled set of archers out there who are starting to drop stuff, let's say over 80. And I do think there's some drag benefits of mechanicals over fixed blades for some dudes who are taking really far shots. And there's a couple very talented guys I know that'll walk around with 1 or 2 mechanicals in their quiver, kind of tuned and sighted in separately in case they're in those shots. And I think there is a rare breed who can take advantage of those properties at those distances. My recommendation still for Joe Blow, who sends me the DM, is just go fixed blade. I have never had a high quality double bevel fixed blade broadhead fail on me in any way, shape, or form.
They're not gonna.
There's nothing to fail. I also think, like you mentioned it with the thickness of the sidewalls, I think a lot of people are worrying about shit that you had to worry about 15 years ago that you don't have to worry about anymore. I think machining tolerances and construction materials on these premium products like your Arrows and the high-end Black Eagles and the high-end Eastons and the high-end Broadheads that like you're up there with another 3 or 4 guys. The quality is getting so high now that I also think a lot of the things that people were worried about, like going in on a different angle, I don't think going in at 15 or 30 degrees and hitting a rib. I know it doesn't break a day 6 arrow. I know it doesn't break some of those other setups. And I just think the protection, the fail safe, or I don't know what you want to call it, leniency. I don't know how you want to describe it. And if somebody else believes differently and you've dropped a significant number of animals, I'm not going to argue with you. But in my experience, and I want to agree with you on another point, I really like coming out the other side, because I also think there's always this argument about cutting surface compared to penetration. Like, should I create a bigger entry wound that might bleed better, or should I create the greater opportunity for full penetration? And I've always been a pass-through guy. My pass-throughs stack up in 30 yards. And it's like, okay, you're right. There's no blood trail. There is no blood trail, but I can see the dead animal. I don't need a blood trail.
It hasn't had time to fill up yet.
That's the thing. And I have had instances where I did have to blood trail those animals, and you might have to spend some time covering that first 50 or 60 yards blind before you start to see where the blood is coming out. And I prefer a smaller bleeder because I would rather the greater penetration. And I am willing to sacrifice a bit of blood trail. I will admit a bigger bleeder is going to create a better blood trail, but I think you're going to have less likelihood of a full pass through. And if you put a gun to my head, I'm taking full pass through over a better blood trail to an animal that didn't die.
Absolutely. Well, bleeders are a great discussion, a great topic, because I shot 2 blades, just straight 2 blades forever, especially out of my stick bows. And you just can't get a better designed head than just a straight 2 blade for 2 things: penetration and bone breaching. There's nothing better. But what I noticed is that with a really sharp 2 blade is that you had this perfect slit entry and a perfect slit exit. And you had these opposing pieces of hide, skin, and meat that immediately just married right back together.
Yes.
And it had very little blood loss. The other thing that you have is that if you have an animal that's taking a little bit longer to die, those perfect slits will coagulate and they'll clot up way faster and seal off. The only reason that I shoot, that I wanted to have a bleeder was two reasons. First was to disrupt that perfect slit that we just talked about.
Yep.
To put that little X in it so it can't heal up and it can't, it'll create more blood loss. And so what you're doing is when you slice hide, it's going to continue to open. as the animal moves. If you put another cut in it that's, perpendicular to your main cut, now you've got another crease that can open and another slice that can open as that animal moves. The other reason that I wanted a bleeder is I wanted to reduce sidewall friction.
Right.
So if you're cutting that cross cut now,
Yeah.
now what you're doing is you're opening up a bigger hole and less friction for that arrow to pass through. Now, this is where you look at our heads and you go, well, your heads are not much different than a lot of what other people have. They actually are. There's some subtle differences, but they're important to me. If you look at the location and placement of our bleeder, it's in front of the ferrule, not at the back. It accomplishes two things that are incredibly important to me. Number one, having it in front of the ferrule is opening up that hole so you don't have to have any friction on the body of the broadhead or the ferrule as it goes through. You're leading with blades and slicing. The other thing is that if your bleeder is an afterthought and you just jam it on the back, it has to stick straight out. And now you have it cracks me up when I hear people talk about how important the blade angle is, because it's incredibly important, and how their main blade angle is so perfect. But then don't look at the bleeder, because it doesn't apply to that.
Right.
It only applies to which is horseshit. So by having your bleeder up front, you have the ability to elongate it and have that you have the same width, but you can have that long slicing blade angle now that doesn't create any chopping effect or create drag to reduce penetration. So that's the two reasons we did it that way. All of this stuff is incredibly important to me. Now, are we talking about finite details? We are. But I'll tell you this, the guys that for people that watch the guys like Remy and Lampers and guys like that, they're like, how do they always come off the mountain with not just an animal, but the biggest sumbitch up there? It's because they obsess over those finite details.
Yeah.
That's the difference. It's the effort and the details. And for me, it's all important. It all adds up. And so when I'm building an arrow broadhead system, my philosophy is chips make a pile. If my bleeder design is 1% better, that's great. If my main blade design and material and that double bevel edge is 1% better, that's great. If having that collar on the end of the arrow is 1% better to reduce sidewalk friction, that's great. You start adding all of these things up. If my arrow flight is a 5% increase, that's great. Well, the next thing you know, once you start taking all these things that you've obsessed over that have been 1, 2, 3, 4, 5%, in the aggregate, chips make a pile. You've just improved your entire kit by 20% if you add it all together. Now that is a real improvement. And if you just ignore the 1% things, it's the sum of all parts. Everything has got to be perfect. And that's basically been my mantra my entire bow hunting career, after I screwed up so much in the early days doing it wrong. I mean, this will put it in perspective for you how my hunting was in Alabama when I was young. My senior year of high school, I decided not to play football, but I still had 6th period athletics. And I had 5th period study hall, and 4th period was lunch. So after 3rd period every day, I left school and I went bow hunting every day, every afternoon. And bow hunting by the time I was a senior in high school, it was everything. It was life. And nothing else mattered. I had such a problem shooting then. I'd been hunting probably about 5 years, and I missed the first 11 deer that I shot at my senior year of high school. the first 11 deer. And it was a tiny, just a goofy little thing that was happening to me in my tree stand, to where shooting on the ground, I was deadly. When I got in a tree stand, what was happening is I was looking under my peep,
Okay.
not through it,
Yeah,
because I was anchoring differently and at a different angle, and I was looking under my peep, and I was shooting over all these deer. So I'm sorry, shooting under all these deer. And so, but it was just this one little finite detail that I couldn't figure out. When I finally figured out what I was doing on the 12th deer, I said, okay, you're going to draw and you are not going to shoot. And I'm forced myself to count to 10. And while I was counting to 10, look at every little thing. And I was sitting there holding on this buck, waiting, counting to 10, looking at everything, seeing what was wrong. And that's when I realized it came into focus that I was looking under my peep. And so I made that slight adjustment and ended up killing 25 bucks that year, my senior year of high school with a bow. I know that sounds obnoxious now, but back then that was Alabama. You shot every buck you saw, and
right.
This is like late 80s, and I mean they encouraged you to kill 2 deer, a buck a doe a day for 120 days.
Yeah.
So, but anyway,
That's
it was but that's a little finite detail that if it goes unnoticed, it ruins your season.
Yeah.
And so that's why you have to obsess over all the little 1%ers. To me, that's the key to success.
This has been a phenomenal conversation, and I would love to hop on and have a round 2 at some point and pick your brain even more. Wrapping up, give us some info for day 6. Obviously, I will link everything, but give us a little overview just of the product selection. And I know a lot of people want the reliability of a custom built arrow, but don't have an arrow saw and a bench press, and everything else to set that up. And I know you guys have some customized options available. So maybe close us out here and with a bit of a guidebook on how somebody could get themselves into the day 6 system.
Yeah, I mean, it's super easy. Our website, we have spent the last year revamping it and launched a new website at the first of the year, I believe, right after or sometime at the end of January. And what we were trying to do is make it to where it was more user friendly for those guys that you're talking about, that they want the custom arrow. They don't know how to get there. So we have multiple ways to go on there and determine what you need. You can just put in your draw length, draw weight of your bow, and your point weight, and it'll spit out an arrow for you. We also have the guys that want the totally custom built, everything perfect, match grade, everything weighed perfect, spine matched, all that. We have our blueprinted section to where you can go in there and just do whatever you want. That has really been very surprising to me, Jay, because I'm not that guy.
Yeah, me neither.
But
they're out there. And a lot of what I do, actually, doing the high-end gear reviews, I'm less surprised now than I was before, especially with the newer entrant into the hunting market. These late 30s, early 40s dudes, very successful in what they do.
Yep.
And I think these are the guys who 20 years would have guided everything because they had the money to do it. But now they want the soul satisfying DIY experience, and they want to challenge themselves, but they also recognize where their value lies. Yeah. They're better off spending an hour at work where they bill out at $250 than an hour at home cutting arrows, but they still want the reliability of that system. It's just a very mathematical decision. I'm better off spending my time over here and my money over here.
Well, that's exactly right. Like I told you when I was younger and I worked in this outdoor store through high school and early in college, I thought I was going to work there the rest of my life. I loved it. It was all hunting every day. And then I realized the guys that were coming through in their suits were the guys that were going elk hunting and moose hunting and caribou hunting, and they were fishing in the Keys and fishing in the Bahamas. I was like, shit, this ain't gonna
They
work.
ain't working in bow shops, my friend.
Heck no. I got to
No.
go out there and make money to go do
Yeah.
this stuff. I mean,
I
all right,
preach that to the young guys all the time. Like, have a little bit of delayed gratification, because if you put that effort in now and you get up those couple tax brackets, it's going to enable you to have that freedom. And then you can decide, do I want to be the guy to sit at home and build my arrows, or do I want to pay somebody to build them? But if you don't do that, if you don't exercise that delayed gratification and have that extra ambition, you're not going to do either. You're going to be the guy taking free arrows from the manufacturer because you work in the bow shop and you're making $20 an hour. And
you
know,
work
if you're
every
lucky,
Saturday.
yeah. And if you're lucky, you'll get to go out and stand hunt for a couple hours in the morning before going in and fixing everybody else's bows.
That's it. So, but yeah, for us, I mean, I'm always surprised. It's the more detailed, higher end stuff that people really want.
Yes.
But we have everything. And the cool thing about this company is when you call day 6, you talk to me.
Right.
And I'm going to keep it that way as long as I can. I don't want to offend anybody, but I don't want, some 20-something-year-old kid answering the phone trying to answer questions.
Yeah.
I want to be able to help every single person that comes to this company and talk to them one-on-one and understand what nuances there is. Because it could be a simple question of, this guy's like, man, I've looked at all the YouTube things. I'm trying to tune my bow. Everything's reacting the opposite way. I just can't figure it out. I'm beating my head against the wall. I think there's something wrong with my bow. And it takes a simple question like, are you left-handed? And they go, yes. Everything's backwards. It's the opposite. But a 20-year-old kid's not going to he's going to sit there and fumble through them and confuse them even more. It's the simple things from years of experience that I want to be able to, impart on these people. And man, if anything, if I've spent my life doing this stuff, if I can use that in the service of others, man, that is super rewarding and fulfilling for me. So if we ever get to a point to where I'm not answering the phone, just know I'm miserable, because I love doing it. I love helping guys. So yeah, just, our website's super easy. You can reach out to us, and that's what we're here for, is to help. And people, if you ever talk to people, I'm the worst salesman ever, because if you don't need new stuff, I'm not going to sell you new stuff.
Right.
It's not what it's about for us. The money thing is secondary. So,
man.
Yeah, man.
Again, thank you for your time, Bryan. This was incredibly entertaining and educating. So I greatly appreciate it. And I'm sure we'll talk soon.
You bet.
All right. Cheers, man.
Yep.